I was living in a McLeodganj, a Tibetan village where the Dalai Lama lives. There was a Canadian woman, or from Newfoundland, that was teaching yoga to the Western nuns and monks. So I thought I'd go and join. And that's when I started. So I'd have to walk an hour down the mountain to get to where the yoga class was. I was maybe 29. Then I ended up going down to the Institute in Pune just for a month. And in those days, to the Iyengar Institute, in those days you could just book in and go. Now you'd have to be with a studio and go with a teacher. It's much more political and who can get there. And so I went there for a month and ended up in Japan sometime later and started teaching there. The best way to learn anything is to teach. And I had no idea years ago in the mountains in India in this little cafe where all the astrologers would sit. I'm not an astrologer, but they'd all sit, oh yeah, teaching is so strong in your chart. I'd go, oh, come on. But it's what my calling was, and I had no idea in my late 20s. And ended up in Melbourne. And in those days in Melbourne, yoga was fringe. There was Swami Sarasvati that had her TV program. And there was a few of us that rented a warehouse in Melbourne, in Carlton, and we just took in turn to lead because we wanted to practice. So that's where I really started to learn to teach. And then I ended up moving up here.
My mother started doing yoga after I was born. I was the last of 6 children. And with 6 children, she was a bit stressed out and was looking for something that was going to relax her. And yeah, she found yoga, which was really supportive. And so consequently, she would drag, not just myself, but me and my sisters along to some classes. And we were lucky enough, back then, we lived in the southern part of Sydney, that there was a small yoga studio then. It was Integral Yoga from Swami Satchidananda. And so we would go, we were introduced, and then when I was old enough on my own, from probably about 12, 13, that we could go on our own, and we would, loved it. So I would do that. I even did it at school, and then I always say when people ask me when I seriously started was approximately about 17, because I'd left home and I moved and travelled, and I ended up in Western Australia. I found a teacher there. Got really passionate about it, and then I started practicing every day.
When I came to the Shire in those days, it was very different. Shops. There was no shop open after 6 o'clock in the evening. Winter was very, very quiet. It was almost too boring.
And I ended up choosing to stay here because of the community. And even then, this is back in 1986, I think, or 1987. And it was just a really, even though it was a much smaller place, but there was a lovely community here that I didn't feel where I was living before.
A few teachers would be in halls here and there, but there were no yoga studios in those days. And I was working at the Buttery as a secretary, working in an office, and I started teaching Iyengar yoga at the Vision Studio, maybe 82, 83. So the Vision Dance Studio was a place that you could hire. Ginny had set this up as a dance studio and wanted to sublet. And I think I ended up having, there'd be 8 classes a week that I taught eventually.
I had been teaching already, and I remember coming to the area. There was Jenny Groves at that point in Byron that I met, that she'd already been here for, I don't think that long, but for maybe even a couple of years. And so we connected, and I also started there in Byron. I think I was doing a class at Vision Studios, and then I also started my own classes in Mullumbimby. And I just started doing at the Pioneer Hall. And also it was upstairs where the original Santos used to be there. I might have run from there. Geez, time goes, 8 or 10 years. And then I moved to my own studio above the Westpac Bank in Byron. There was 3 of us that said, yeah, let's move to this new space.
And so I organised it all, and then they backed out. So I was left with this new venue. So I probably would have stayed where I was because it was fine, but in the meantime, change brings change. I'd had a child, and then there were more other studios opening up. So I just moved it to home, and with a young child, then I had another kid a few years later. So I made it more home.
For a small area, which particularly back then, you know, the population was, you know, relatively small, the classes were really well-sized classes. There were lots of people that came to the classes and, you know, were really into the yoga.
High school students at Byron Bay have found a way to cope with stress from all that study. They've taken on a fresh subject, yoga.
Wednesday afternoon, and while most Byron Bay High School students are headed for the nearest sporting field, this group of around 30 are preparing for a 90-minute yoga session. It all looks peaceful enough, but according to instructor Jennifer Groves, anyone looking for a lazy afternoon is in the wrong place.
Sometimes it gets a little bit physically demanding, where I'm asking them to go to stretch and work quite hard.
The yoga session includes a number of stretching and breathing exercises which help the students relax.
I also, in those days, set yoga up in high schools in Mullumbimby High, Byron High and Ballina High, and was teaching in high schools. And in those days in Mullumbimby High, it was very much had to go through the P&C committee. The Christians wanted to know that it wasn't something that was going to be untoward for their Christian values. And then once it got through in Mullumbimby High, it got through in Byron High, then it got through Ballina High. So I had to go through all that, whereas today that wouldn't be an issue.
A lot of people, when you mention the word yoga, they tend to think of sort of people in white sheets and funny hats and, you know, and a funny religion and all of this kind of thing. What would you say, or why would you recommend that somebody perhaps studied yoga as opposed to maybe aerobics or some of the more modern day things?
I would recommend a yoga because it's much more a holistic way of working that sort of works on every level.
When I was, you know, first started, you know, seriously practicing, it was still really the first influx of coming into the West. Yes, it had been happening in the 60s and the 70s but still on a very smaller scale. And then it was still in its early days, really. And I felt as Westerners, you know, I felt like, you know, we were sort of guinea pigs in a way of, you know, testing out this practice and working in a way that, you know, I speak for myself, I feel like I made a lot of mistakes in my approach to it. You know, we were young, we were experimenting, it was fun and doing all of that. But at some point, you know, it's not about doing, obviously it's not about doing advanced asanas and needing to, you know, put your legs behind your head and do all this crazy stuff. So now, you know, the practice is, I call it more of a maintenance practice, that I'm keeping my body healthy, moving the energy, you know, hopefully that, you know, can be purposeful to up into an old age where we can, you know, stay and remain, you know, agile.
Then just turn to your left or turn to your right. And are you turning from your eyes? Are you turning from your head? Are you turning from your So pelvis? I did Iyengar yoga, and I'm one of these people that have a very flexible body, and I got a lot of injuries and damages from yoga. Overstretching, ligament laxity, having kids older. And for some people, yoga is great, it fixes things. And so my inquiry became, well, if I'm doing this and I'm hurting myself, let's see what I can learn differently. And I came across Feldenkrais work, which is more neurological reprogramming of, rather than the muscles, it's the brain, and it's the plasticity of the brain to learn what you do. And I mixed it with yoga for quite some years, and that was very successful. But in that time there was more and more yoga teachers, and so I thought, well, there's so many yoga teachers, I'll just follow my path of learning somatic work. And I discovered Ruthie Alon's work, Bones for Life. Her programs have progressed under the banner of movement intelligence, and it just made so much sense to me. So that's what I do. There's a few other yoga teachers that have taught here that now teach in Europe, in Goa. I'm teaching in Taiwan. Looks like I'll be doing some work in China next year.
So the last big training I did in this area was in 2004, I think, or 2005. I decided to sort of change things, and I got rid of the yoga studios that I had in Byron, and I simplified my life. So I didn't feel I wanted the responsibility anymore that I had, and with running studios and things like that. And I took my work more overseas.
My peers are across the oceans, but in some ways, being in a small community, I don't have to conform, and it gives me a freedom, even though there's an isolation. So there's the paradox with that.
It was special times with fond memories in this area of the community, and because it was small and such an incredible place, and even the ones that we still meet that was still here in amongst a more populated area. But yeah, I think we were very lucky to have experienced it in those times.